And every time I would come back to public school, it would be kind of an issue.
In the whirlwind of Hollywood, Ron Howard has long been the eye of the storm, a filmmaker defined by a quiet dignity, restraint, and a fundamental kindness. But when a question was posed to him, a question about the shadowed corners of the very business that raised him, his composure fractured. "You have no idea what those icons were capable of," he once confided, his voice barely a whisper. In his eyes, the celebrated Hollywood's golden age was never golden. It was a kingdom built on secrets, on casual cruelty, and the exploitation of the hopeful, a world where stardom was a license for anything. The very men who crafted America's most cherished dreams were the same men who systematically shattered lives behind the velvet curtains, and now, after years of silence, Ron Howard is ready to speak their names. We begin with Errol Flynn, the devil with a dazzling smile. Before the world knew James Bond or Jack Sparrow, there was Errol Flynn, the original swashbuckler, a man who was the very embodiment of roguish charm, thrilling danger, and untamed desire. On the silver screen, he was the perfect adventurer. Off-screen, he was something far more predatory. Born in 1909 in Tasmania, Flynn descended upon Hollywood in the 1930s, becoming a supernova after Captain Blood in 1935. The studios built a throne for him, propped up by his charisma, but beneath that gleaming polish was a man being devoured by his own arrogance and appetites. By 1942, his glittering reputation had begun to tarnish and turn toxic. Two young women, little more than girls, Peggy Satterlee and Betty Hansen, accused Flynn of the most grievous of acts. The trial became a national spectacle, its lurid details cleaving America in two. Flynn sauntered through testimony, a smirk playing on his lips, mocking the charges as if his celebrity made him divine. Warner Brothers, in turn, dispatched its most formidable lawyers, while adoring fans held vigil outside the courthouse, and studio fixers allegedly ensured key witnesses simply vanished. He walked free, yet the acquittal only seemed to unleash him. In private letters, unearthed decades later, in 1978, Flynn bragged of his conquests and cruelly mocked the women who had come to fear him. Ron Howard once described learning of that trial as a chilling turning point, when I realized Hollywood would protect its monsters as long as they smiled for the camera. To the public, Flynn remained the lovable rogue. To those on the inside, he was a ghost story in the making. By 1959, at just 50 years old, he was a ruin consumed by alcohol, narcotics, and financial collapse. His body finally surrendered in a Vancouver apartment, the final price for years of abuse. The official report listed heart failure, cirrhosis, and ulcers. But for Howard, the true cause of death was simpler. He expired as he had lived, taking everything and giving back nothing. Flynn's story became a dark blueprint for the industry's moral decay, a haunting reminder that charm can be a mask for cruelty, and that fame, in the final act, offers no absolution. This brings us to another titan, Kirk Douglas, the man who couldn't stop fighting. To Ron Howard, Kirk Douglas was the living, breathing contradiction of Hollywood's golden era, a man who preached honor and justice on screen while dealing in fear and humiliation off of it. Born Isur Danielovich in 1916 to penniless immigrant parents, Douglas clawed his way from the gutter through sheer, unbending will. By the time Spartacus made him a global icon, he had conquered the world, fame, fortune, and the respect of millions. But those who stood beside him on set remembered something else, something darker, a volcanic temper that never cooled when the cameras stopped rolling. Crew members spoke in hushed tones of a man impossible to please, given to sudden, violent explosions of rage that left people emotionally shattered. Actress Deborah Paget once remarked, "He didn't just want to dominate a scene, he wanted to dominate every soul within it." Howard, who studied Douglas's work as a young filmmaker, later admitted, "There's a kind of rage under that smile, the kind that eats a person alive." That rage would cast a long shadow over Douglas's entire career. Whispers of his conduct around women have haunted the canyons of Hollywood for decades, with biographers and insiders alike, pointing toward his alleged involvement in a harrowing incident in the 1950s with a rising actress named Natalie Wood when she was just 16 years old. an allegation that would only break the surface long after Wood was gone, echoed by her own sister, Lana, in a 2018 memoir. Yet, Douglas never answered for it. The accusation, swallowed by the same silent machinery that shielded the titans of his time. A silence that held fast even as he passed from this world in 2020, at the remarkable age of 103. But the ghosts of such stories don't stay buried forever. They resurfaced, not as whispered gossip, but as a long-overdue reckoning that would echo across film sets for a new generation. On screen and off, his presence was a paradox, capable of both inspiring greatness and instilling pure terror. The legendary Stanley Kubrick, who wrestled with him on 2 separate films, would later call him the most driven man I've ever met, adding with a heavy pause, and the hardest to control. It was this very sentiment that director Ron Howard would later reflect upon, suggesting the true lesson of Douglas's life wasn't about talent, nor was it about fame. It was about the intoxicating nature of absolute power. Douglas, it seemed, believed the rules were for other men, and for a long, silent time, Hollywood agreed. In 1996, as Douglas accepted an honorary Oscar, the world saw a frail icon seeking peace in his twilight years. But for an observer like Ron Howard, it was a different kind of performance. The final, masterful act of a man who had spent a lifetime outrunning the shadows of his own making. And beneath the thunderous applause, a chilling truth remained, one that Hollywood itself refused to bring into the light. The truth that some of its brightest stars forged their legacies not merely with brilliance, but with the cold, hard currency of fear. Which brings us to Faye Dunaway, the Ice Queen of cruelty. If Errol Flynn was the embodiment of charming corruption, and Kirk Douglas a symbol of unchecked rage, then Faye Dunaway represented something far colder, something more precise. It was cruelty, exquisitely wrapped in the veneer of breathtaking beauty. To a filmmaker like Ron Howard, she was a stark reminder that the darkness in Hollywood didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it manifested in absolute control, in calculated humiliation, and in an ego so monumental it simply suffocated everything and everyone in its orbit. Born in 1941 in the small town of Bascom, Florida, Dunaway's ascent was nothing short of meteoric. From the revolutionary Times, Bonnie and Clyde Times in 1967 to the neo-noir masterpiece Times Chinatown Times in 1974, she was untouchable, an icy, magnetic goddess of the silver screen. But behind the shimmering facade of that brilliance, a very different story was being written. Stories of her cruelty began to circulate, quiet whispers that snaked through sound stages and backlots. Crew members traded tales of her volcanic tantrums, her impossible demands, and a chilling tendency to treat her assistants as utterly disposable. Her Times, Mommy Dearest Times co-star, Rutanya Alda, recalled it vividly. "You could feel the fear on set," she said. "Everyone was just waiting for her to explode." And that film, intended as a dark portrait of monstrous abuse, became, in a strange and chilling irony, a mirror reflecting Dunaway herself. For in the process of playing Joan Crawford, a Hollywood legend infamous for her own brand of cruelty, Dunaway seemed to be channeling more than just the character. The film's director, Frank Perry, would later confess he came close to walking away entirely, worn down by her violent outbursts. Objects were thrown, makeup artists were screamed at, and on one occasion, she flatly refused to film until the cinematography could, in her words, make her look divine. It was this kind of behavior that Ron Howard would cite years later, holding her up as a textbook example of what happens when an artist's profound need for control metastasizes into a form of emotional terrorism. And the stories, they did not stop there. On the set of Times, The Wicked Lady Asterisk, she allegedly slapped a cameraman and spat upon a crew member. During the filming of Times, Don Juan DeMarco Asterisk, her treatment of assistants was reportedly so humiliating that the entire production was forced to a halt for a full day. Her own former manager, Jay Bernstein, once bleakly observed, "Faye doesn't just play divas, she becomes them." And by the 2000s, that reputation had finally caught up with her. The phone in Hollywood simply stopped ringing. Directors, once eager for her talent, now refused to work with her, the word unmanageable attached to her name like a permanent stain. Then, in 2011, After being summarily fired from a Broadway revival of Times T at 5 Asterix, Dunaway's response was to blame everyone and everything but herself. When a journalist later posed a question to Ron Howard about her complicated legacy, his answer was both diplomatic and utterly devastating. "She chased perfection so hard," he said, "she forgot compassion." Dunaway's fall from grace wasn't a sudden, shocking event. It was a slow, painful unraveling. The very woman who had once conquered Hollywood found herself isolated, a pariah avoided even at events meant to celebrate her own monumental work. Through the lens of Ron Howard's experience, she became more than a fallen star. She was a symbol of the ultimate price of cruelty, a cautionary tale that talent, devoid of empathy, will inevitably turn inward and destroy itself. "People talk about power," he once mused, "but in a place like this, power without grace just turns to poison." And few men from Hollywood's golden age wielded more power than our next subject, John Wayne, the tyrant of the West. In the sprawling landscape of Hollywood legends, few shadows stretched as long as John Wayne's. To a generation, he wasn't just an actor, he was America cast in bronze, the stoic cowboy, the valiant soldier, the quintessential man. But for a young Ron Howard, watching the flickering glow of a black and white television, the truth behind that monumental image was a far more troubling picture, painted in shades of gray. Howard would later reflect on that disillusionment, his voice heavy with the memory, "When I discovered the reality of the man, the hero vanished. In his place, I saw a bully, cloaked in the flag." He was born Marion Morrison, in the quiet heartland of Iowa, in 1907. But the man the world would come to know as the Duke was forged in the crucible of the studio system, built upon a carefully constructed myth of unyielding masculinity. By the 1950s, he had transcended the screen. He was no longer just an actor, he was an ideology walking, a monument to a rigid past where dissent was seen as a moral failing and progress a form of betrayal. On the sun-baked studio lots, under the glare of the Klieg lights, his authority was absolute, enforced by a current of intimidation. A technician who missed a cue, a grip who moved too slow, would face his wrath a public dressing down that echoed across the set. Fellow actor Christopher Mitchum recalled the chilling effect. "When Duke got angry," he said, "the very air grew cold. You either fell in line or you were out." It was an atmosphere that Ron Howard, a filmmaker himself, would later define as the very antithesis of creation. "That's not art," he stated. "It's fear masquerading as discipline." But the Duke's harsh reign wasn't confined to the soundstage. It seeped into his interactions, a casual cruelty that belittled women and publicly humiliated indigenous actors on the sets of his iconic westerns. He dismissed black performers who dared to defy the narrow roles prescribed for them. And then, there was the 1971 Playboy interview, a transcript that remains a chilling artifact. It stands as one of the most unsettling documents from the twilight of Hollywood's golden age, a moment where the mask slipped, and he declared with cold certainty that Native Americans were selfishly hoarding land that was not rightfully theirs, and that black people, in his view, had not yet earned the right to govern themselves. He argued that the silver screen needed men, not what he called whiners. When these words resurfaced decades later, they sent shockwaves, revealing not the patriot of legend, but a figure imprisoned by his own prejudices. This darkness bled into his work. On the set of the masterpiece, The Searchers, Wayne engaged in a bitter struggle with director John Ford over the soul of his character, Ethan Edwards. Wayne was insistent on painting the racist, vengeful ex-Confederate as a sympathetic figure. Ford resisted, but Wayne held his ground. The result, etched into the final cut, is a character whose profound cruelty is undeniable. But something else came through as well, the actor's own palpable contempt. It was a performance Ron Howard would later dissect as a film student at USC, calling it terrifying, because you can no longer see the line where the character ends and the man himself begins. To the very end, ravaged by cancer in his final years, Wayne offered no apology, no retraction. His critics were simply soft. He saw himself not as wrong, but as a relic, isolated by a culture that had lost its way. He passed away in 1979, at the age of 72, his death mourned by millions who still saw him as the ultimate American icon. But for a new generation of filmmakers, like Ron Howard, the story of John Wayne served as a stark, cautionary tale, a testament that power built on a foundation of prejudice does not mellow into wisdom with age. Instead, it curdles into a profound bitterness. The myth endures, Howard concluded, but the man who inspired it was never worthy of the legend. Roman Polanski, a name that echoes through the halls of cinema, synonymous with both genius and a permanent, self-imposed exile. For Ron Howard, that name embodied an unsettling truth, the one Hollywood has always struggled to confront, that artistic brilliance can reside within the same soul as profound darkness. "I was an admirer of his work," Howard confessed, "before I understood the man. Then came the chilling realization, talent is not a pardon. Sometimes, it's a hiding place." Polanski's ascent was nothing short of meteoric. Born in Paris in 1933, a child of Polish parents, he was a survivor of the horrors of the Nazi occupation. A life seemingly marked by tragedy, long before the spotlight ever found him. His early cinematic triumphs, Knife in the Water, and later, Rosemary's Baby, anointed him a genius among the critics, a true visionary who could spin paranoia into pure, cinematic poetry. But the shadows that danced across his screens were not mere fiction. They were a reflection of the man behind the camera, and in the cold light of March 1977, that carefully crafted illusion was irrevocably shattered. Roman Polanski was placed under arrest. The charge, the drugging and sexual assault of a 13-year-old girl, Samantha Geimer, following a photo shoot at the Los Angeles residence of Jack Nicholson. The evidence against him was insurmountable. Polanski entered a plea of guilty to the charge of unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor. But before the court could pass sentence, he vanished. He fled the United States, seeking refuge in France. The world saw a tortured artist. But for Ron Howard, then a young filmmaker finding his voice, the justification was a symphony of denial. They debated the sanctity of art, while the fragments of a child's life lay shattered on the floor. In the years that followed, Howard would reflect that Polanski's flight didn't end the story. It became an indelible, spreading stain on the fabric of Hollywood. The director simply moved his set, continuing to create his art from across an ocean. Then came the year 2003. Inside the glittering Dolby Theater, as Polanski won an Oscar for The Pianist, a wave of applause rose to the ceiling, a sound Ron Howard would later describe as both surreal and sickening. But Howard remained seated, a solitary figure in a sea of celebration. His mind wasn't on the film. It was on a 13-year-old girl, and the chilling echo that applause must carry for her, even now. Decades couldn't silence that echo. For him, the industry's chilling ability to surgically separate the artist from the act was more than just a blind spot. It was a deep and infuriating moral failure. In 2020, when France's César Award was placed in Polanski's hands, a different sound filled the air. The roar of protest, the slamming of doors. For Howard, it was the sound of justice, finally finding its voice, however late. A delayed arrival, but perhaps not too late. It had taken the world 40 years to articulate a truth that should have been screamed from the headlines the very next morning, that a monster is no less a monster simply because he knows how to frame a perfect shot. As he articulated to Vanity Fair in 2021, Polanski remains a ghost in his own story, free in Europe, yet forever haunted, untouchable. His name, once a symbol of cinematic genius, had become a byword for hypocrisy. In Howard's eyes, this single story was a microcosm of the poison that coursed through the veins of Hollywood's golden age, a system expertly engineered to protect the creator and discard the creation's human cost. "Hollywood forgives anything," he once remarked with a chilling bitterness, "as long as the lighting is good." And then there was Mickey Rooney, the smile that was a lie. If Roman Polanski represented Hollywood's deep-seated hypocrisy, Mickey Rooney embodied its most dazzling and dangerous illusion, the seductive idea that boundless charm could wash away any trace of cruelty. For Ron Howard, a kid who grew up bathed in the flickering blue light of Rooney's cheerful musicals on late-night television, the discovery of the man behind the curtain came as a profound shock. He was the face of pure joy, Howard once mused, but behind that smile was a well of misery. And worse, he made sure others drank from it. Born Joseph Ewell Jr. in 1920, Mickey Rooney wasn't just a star, he was a supernova, Hollywood's first true child superstar. Before he had even reached the age of 18, he had become the highest-paid actor in all of America. MGM literally built an empire on the wattage of his grin, marketing the perfect all-American boy who sang and danced his way into the nation's heart. But fame of that magnitude, at that age, is a kind of poison. It warped him. He would marry 8 times, cheat with abandon, and gamble away millions under the unforgiving desert sun, leaving a trail of humiliation for anyone who dared to love him. His ex-wife, the legendary Ava Gardner, once famously quipped he was the shortest man with the biggest ego in the world. But behind the closed doors of his mansion, the shadows grew longer. In 2011, a grim final act began, as his 8th wife, Jan Chamberlain, and his stepson faced accusations of elder abuse and systematically manipulating his finances, allegedly draining his accounts and isolating the fading star from his own family. Yet, the seeds of this tragedy were sown decades earlier, in the damage Rooney himself inflicted upon others. That damage was already the stuff of Hollywood legend. Former co-stars spoke in hushed tones of a man both volatile and cruel. And then there was Judy Garland, his closest friend and confidant during those breathless MGM years. She once confessed in a private moment, "He could make you laugh one second and absolutely destroy you the next." Garland, herself a fragile soul crushed by the weight of the studio system, was emotionally shattered. In later years, she would hint that it wasn't just the executives in their cold, sterile offices. Rooney, her friend, shared the blame for her pain. By the 1960s, his own world had imploded in a firestorm of addiction, bankruptcy, and scandal shadows that followed him everywhere he went. In a 1979 interview, a defiant Rooney claimed, "I've lived 1,000 lives," but as Ron Howard would later reflect, the tragedy was that he lived every single one of them for himself. Even as the years etched themselves onto his face, the bitterness never faded. He cast blame like a net, catching everyone, the studios, his wives, even God, for a downfall of his own making. When the final curtain fell in 2014, at the age of 93, his entire estate was valued at less than $20,000. For a time, his body lay unclaimed, a final, lonely indignity, before he was at last buried in a Los Angeles cemetery, and only after friends pooled their money to afford him a modest funeral. For Ron Howard, Rooney's cautionary tale was the final damning piece of a much larger puzzle, irrefutable proof that the brilliant smiles of the golden age were little more than masks. "He made the world laugh while he was dying inside," Howard observed, "and maybe that's the saddest kind of evil there is. When your own pain becomes a performance and not a single person in the audience notices it's real." For Ron Howard, excavating these stories was never an act of revenge. They were warnings. That Hollywood's golden age wasn't forged from gold at all. It was built on a bedrock of silence, cemented with exploitation, and haunted by the broken lives hidden just behind the blinding glare of the spotlights. It leaves us with a chilling truth, one he himself observed. The most terrifying monsters are not born of fiction. They are the ones shielded by the very spotlight that creates a star. This town is a study in contrasts, from the celebrated career of a filmmaker like Ron Howard to the cautionary tales we've explored. Whose hidden life was the most unsettling revelation? Let the discussion begin in the comments below. To ensure you don't miss our next journey into the shadows, subscribe to the channel, for there are countless stories still buried beneath the faded glamour of Hollywood's golden age.